Who makes the rules for AI? Right now, a handful of companies and governments are shaping its trajectory, but what happens behind closed doors? Helen Toner, Director of Strategy at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology and former OpenAI board member, has been inside some of the biggest AI governance conversations. In this guest lecture, she joins Beatrice Erkers in conversation to share an insider's take on AI policy, US-China dynamics, and what's coming next in AI regulation.
Thank you so much, Helen, for joining us today. Why don't we just start with you introducing yourself and telling us what it is that you're working on?
Sure. Hi, I'm Helen Toner. I work at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. We're a research organization, like a think tank within Georgetown, and we've been working for the past 6 years on issues at the intersection of national security and emerging technology, and especially national security and AI. So a lot of my work touches on issues related to AI safety and security, also US-China competition, understanding the Chinese tech ecosystem, and my colleagues work on all kinds of issues in and around that space.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, let's just dive in. What, from your perspective, if we look at the current sort of AI governance landscape, what do you think is missing? Like what exists to begin with, and what do you think we should be trying to make come into existence?
Yeah, I think the way that I think about the landscape right now is we had many years of AI developing on the technical side and not receiving all that much policy or governance attention. Then there was this big ChatGPT moment at the end of 2022, where obviously ChatGPT took the world by storm, and suddenly policymakers were paying much more attention to AI. And I think there was a window in 2023 or thereabouts where it looked like maybe there was going to be space for a big policy action in the US. There has been policy action elsewhere. Of course, the EU has its AI Act that is in the process of being implemented right now. But the US, I'm based in Washington, D.C. On this side, it looks like that window has ebbed or closed potentially. And so what I think is needed now is not so much a big push to get some big bill through. I think that's probably not going to work. But what I think we need is better ways to handle all of the uncertainty and disagreement in this space. So I think a really big problem with policy focused on AI, especially policy that's interested in especially advanced AI or frontier AI systems pushing towards AGI, captive AI systems, a big problem there is the lack of agreement and the lack of clarity about what these systems can do, what the next few years are going to look like, what the big problems are. So some people think the tech is going to proceed incredibly quickly, get very dangerous very fast. Other people think it might proceed quickly, but it won't be dangerous. Other people think it's going to proceed very slowly and not really change things very much. And so where that leaves me in terms of governance approaches and interventions is how do we build more shared reality about what is actually going on in this space? How do we do things like improve it sounds nerdy, but improve the measurement science or the metrology of what is going on with AI systems? How do we measure how smart they are? How do we keep track of the progression? How do we measure what risks different systems can pose as they get more capable? Similarly, what kinds of transparency measures could be helpful to help us have, again, more of a shared picture of what is happening here? Are there ways that you could require, disclosure you could require from the big AI companies that are building these most advanced systems, so they have to share information about what tests they're running and what results they're getting and what safety practices they're using, things like that. And I think there's also a lot of promise in, again, because of this sort of huge amount of uncertainty and disagreement, a lot of promise in what sometimes gets called if-then governance, meaning governance approaches that are set up so if you observe a certain thing, then you will take certain actions. And so what we've seen so far on this front is mostly on the voluntary side from inside industry. So this is things like companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, Google DeepMind have released different policies basically describing if we start to build AI systems that show these kinds of capabilities that might be concerning, so very advanced cyber capabilities, very advanced autonomy, ways that the model could potentially get out of control, advanced weapons development capabilities and biological weapons or similar. If we see these capabilities, here's how we would respond. Here's when we would stop developing. Here's when we would stop releasing publicly. And so that whole category of approaches gets called if-then governance. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done on fleshing out what are the potential ifs, how in detail, how do you tell if you're developing those capabilities that are concerning, and what are the thens? Then what do you do? How do you safeguard it? When do you pause? How do you pause if your competitors are going to just keep charging ahead? So I think those are a few categories where I see a lot of promise, even though I think the appetite for kind of binding regulation is very low right now, especially in the United States.
Okay, that's great. And yeah, this is in the United States. What do you think if you think on a more global scale? I think you mentioned US, China, and I think that's something that current AI development is happening in this landscape that is dominated by this at least narrative of US-China competition. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how should we, is it possible to have like meaningful international cooperation in this space?
I think it depends what you mean by meaningful international cooperation. I think some AI governance discussions, in my view, tend to get a little overfixated on trying to get binding treaties or other kinds of really enforceable international arrangements or enforceable deals between the US and China. I tend to think that there's very little appetite for that right now. I think the era of kind of binding multilateral treaties and international cooperation, that was really big in the mid to late 20th century, and I think has been on the decline since then. And certainly we're recording this in early March 2025. And I think there is just the way the world stage is looking right now in terms of US appetite for presence in Europe, European trust in the US-China mutual trust and interest in communication and conversation, and all of those things are very low. So I think the sort of traditional style of international cooperation that people sometimes envision does not seem very promising to me right now. I do think there are other types of cooperation that are potentially more promising. Again, coming back to this idea of how do we build more of a shared reality, more of a shared picture of what is actually going on, what the risks are. And I think that is something where you can actually have some amount of meaningful international coordination just by sharing information about what you're doing, trying to develop better tests of what AI systems are capable of, or better protocols. I think here, for example, the US has put out a political declaration on the responsible use of AI in the military, where they initially just unilaterally put out this set of rules or set of guidelines that they're going to use for themselves, and then went out and got, I think, more than 40 other countries to sign on to this declaration. It's not binding, there's no enforcement, but it is actually relatively detailed and I think relatively productive. And so I think there is a lot of need for international coordination, but also a need to be quite creative about what are the ways that you can actually do that, given the geopolitical situation that the world finds itself in today.
So is that like can governance do something to encourage that, or is that more like up to the companies, or what can be done?
I think I think there's different openings in different places. So I think one very open question right now is what the future of the series of international summits is going to look like. So there's a series of, it's been 3 so far. The first one was an AI safety summit in the UK. The second one was just an AI summit. They took out the safety and in Seoul. And then the third one just this past month was the AI Action Summit in Paris, which was seen as a pretty disappointing event by a lot of people in the AI safety and governance space, having really lost the focus on being concerned at all about downsides or risks and purely focusing on kind of investment and acceleration and pushing the tech forward, which is perfectly good. There's a lot of good that AI will be able to do, but it was not what the original set of these summits had been focused on. So there's one open question, which is what's the future of those summits going to be? And that's something where any country participating could potentially contribute to what is going to happen there. Likewise, there's a set of AI safety institutes that have been set up in a range of countries. The UK is known for having an especially large and well-developed and competent AI safety institute, now actually recently renamed the AI Security Institute, but same acronym, AC. And a range of other countries have also put together similar institutes, which are, I think, generally not intended to be regulatory bodies, but instead to be centers of excellence within government and centers of technical competence that can be testing models and thinking through risks and coordinating between industry and other countries. So I think there's a few different avenues depending on kind of where you're positioned and what you're working on, where you can potentially push forward these kind of arrangements.
Great, yeah. So one of the sort of framings in this course has been the division between tool AI, meaning AI that we use for more narrow, like human-controlled systems, and then more potential AGI, like artificial general intelligence, which is more autonomous and general systems. I'd love to hear your thoughts just on that split in general and how you think we should think about it, because I assume we don't want to conflate the two when we discuss policy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think conflating those two is not very helpful. I think also in general in AI policy, I think a really important thing to keep in mind is that AI is so many different things, and AI can be used in so many different ways that I think it's almost impossible to do kind of policy or governance for all of AI. But instead, you're going to have to choose what slice you want to focus on, even within what you might call tool AI or we might call more basic systems. there's going to be very different policy and governance issues if we're talking about autonomous vehicles versus AI in healthcare versus AI in education, AI in finance, just so many different policy issues to talk about. I don't personally tend to think primarily in terms of that kind of tool versus AGI split. I think partly because this question of is it a tool or is it autonomous, there's quite a lot of overlap and blurriness there. So for example, autonomous vehicles, they're autonomous, that's the whole point, but they're also pretty limited in sort of scope in what they're able to do and where they're able to operate. Whereas you might have some of the large language models that we have today are very sophisticated and very advanced, but they are just, to the extent that they're just present in a chat window, they're essentially tools because they're not doing things autonomously. You can imagine a lot of my work focuses on the national security space. And so I think as well about in a military setting, people sometimes, I think, focus excessively on autonomous weapons as a concerning thing, where I think there's plenty to be thinking and worrying about as well in terms of something like a decision support system, for example. So an AI system that is helping a commander to understand the battlefield and figure out what to do. That might be really a tool in any way you conceive of it because it's only advising, it's only providing information. But if you have a system like that is malfunctioning in some way or is not processing information the way that we think it's processing the information, that could be incredibly dangerous. I think definitely on board with trying to split out different issues according to different types of AI systems and different ways that you might use them. But I don't know that I would personally go for that split as the primary one. And if I had to actually pick one sort of binary split in terms of conceptually thinking about the space, I think maybe a different one that I would suggest would be, what are the problems that we can handle reactively as they come? And what are the problems where we really need to be proactively in advance, putting things in place, putting guardrails in place, putting preventive measures in place? And I think that the vast majority of problems are really in that reactive category, the first category. I think mostly a lot of things that we see in society in general, a lot of the issues that we've encountered with new technologies in the past, it's much better. It's just better to wait and see what happens, which things materialize, what kinds of harms actually do occur, because often it's not what we would have guessed. And often if you are intervening in advance and trying to prevent any potential harm from happening, you're going to actually shut off a huge amount of potential benefit as well. I do tend to think that in AI, there are some of this second category of problems where we really need to be putting things into place in advance, but at a minimum, having an eagle eye for these sort of if-then approaches of if we see this kind of thing, then we need to be ready to take these steps, which you could think of that as responsive, but it's a kind of responsiveness that requires a lot of prep and a lot of readiness. And so I think that is really, to me, that's when you start thinking about particularly advanced systems that could enable novel weapons development or systems that could potentially evade human control entirely, really getting into that. The terminology is always fuzzy, but into that zone of kind of artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, that kind of thing is where maybe more of these preventive approaches are needed. But I think it is important to just always remember that approach of trying to anticipate and prevent is pretty dicey and is not the default way that I think we should be trying to handle risks from new technologies, because I think in the past, it's generally not what works best. So I think trying to have that approach for a very narrow slice of the most severe and most difficult to recover from problems is the right way to go.
Very interesting. It sounds like this course, we do a lot of world building, for example. Sounds like scenario planning in general would be, is like a useful tool for these types of challenges where you need to consider if this, then that, like if this scenario, then that. And so this is very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
And you touched on it yourself. I think these sort of conversations, we often end up focusing on like the worst case scenarios maybe, or not the so great scenarios. Which is obviously like very important. But one of the framings also for this course is what we call existential hope, meaning we think it is possible to have a radically much better future. For example, we should think about what we want that future to look like and see if we can steer towards it somewhat, or that at least will make it more likely to reach it. Do you think that a framing like that can be helpful? And in general, do you have anything like, how do you think about balancing the sort of risk mitigation in terms of AI, but also how it can be used as a force for good?
Yeah, I definitely think that's important. I think it's important for a few reasons, and not just because it feels good or makes us happier as we're doing this work. One reason I think it's important is just that if AI were only a dangerous technology and only had downsides, then it would be, from a policy perspective, would just be so much more straightforward. We could just not build it. But I think it's just true. It's a truism, but truisms are true that AI could potentially solve so many grand challenges: disease, hunger, climate change, energy, these kinds of things I do think are really within our grasp. Even something as simple as, if we have autonomous vehicles, could we have the tens of thousands of people who die on the roads every year? Just tens of thousands in the US, I'm sure it's hundreds of thousands worldwide. So I very much think that there is a huge amount of potential good, a huge amount of potential upside here. I also think it's important to be thinking through these kind of existential hope scenarios of thinking about what are potentially good worlds we could steer towards, because I don't think it's at all a given that we get them, even if we solve some of the sort of safety challenges. I think there's many different challenges that we're going to face, and maybe step 0 is, are the systems safe and reliable enough that they don't cause massive harm? I think that is really a really important step, but it's only step 0. If you have systems that, for example, do reliably do what their users want them to do, if you get very advanced AI, that's going to be an enormously powerful technology. So the people who have that technology in their hands are going to be much more powerful than they were before. You can think about, some people think about this in terms of kind of labor and capital, of does this really reduce the power of labor and increase the power of people who hold capital? That's one sort of more economic way of thinking about it. But I think, yeah, there's just a broader question of what do worlds look like where you have an enormous amount of automated cognitive labor? How does the everyday person's life look good in that world? Where are they getting their resources from? What does their day-to-day look like? Not because I think, again, with this like reactive versus preventive planning, I don't think we should pick one future and try to steer only directly towards that future. But I think if we don't, I think right now we really are lacking any kind of menu of possibilities or even set of inspirations for how does the world look if you have computer systems that can do so many of the tasks that we currently associate only with being human. So yeah, all that to say, I do think that kind of framing is valuable. And I think that kind of scenario work and visioning work as well is really important.
And feel free to decline on this one, but if you think of the one scenario where it has gone relatively well by 2035, what does that look like to you?
I think by 2035, to me, I tend to think that we're a very adaptive species and we can get used to a lot of things and digest a whole lot of changes if we have time. So to me, by default, I think the scenarios that I expect to look best are the ones where the technology is proceeding relatively slowly. And I think that scenarios where the technology has gone very fast and things look good in 2035 is more where I would love to see, for people watching this, love to see your ideas of what does that look like? How did that go smoothly? Is it just that we got lucky and things turned out to be easier than we thought they might be? Or what are the proactive things we could be doing now to help steer towards those worlds?
Yeah. Wise words. Is there anything you think we've missed touching on in this conversation, or anything else that you think we should mention?
I think it was a good conversation. There's always more to say. I think for folks getting into this space, I always say, don't assume that anyone has it figured out. Always feel empowered to bring your own perspective and your own fresh eyes to these questions, even if you're encountering people who are saying, here's a taxonomy of, these are the three problems we face, and here are the 12 ways we could potentially solve them. It's helpful that people are developing those kind of ideas, but no one has it figured out. Yeah, glad that folks are interested in these topics, and I hope that this is helpful for all of you who are trying to get into the space.
Yeah, I realize I have one more question that I just want to ask, which is, so for someone like, maybe you think, oh, I need to be like super technical or have a lot of technical knowledge to get into this, or like to be able to help steer the trajectory of AI development. Is that something that you would say is true, or like how would you recommend that they can start to engage if they want to?
Yeah, I think it is valuable if you're just coming into AI for the first time. I think it's valuable to get a little bit of a sense of the underlying technology, and depending on your background, that will depend on how far you can go. So if you can put up with a little tiny bit of calculus and a little tiny bit of programming, then I think it's actually pretty feasible to go through online courses about what are the basics of a neural network, like what is going on there. I think that can be quite empowering because it's really not that complicated technically. What makes it complicated is just the scale at which this is happening, how many artificial quote unquote neurons are involved, ends up the scale is hard to keep track of, but the underlying math and computer science is actually very simple. So I think if that's something that feels approachable to you, then it is worth putting in the time to understand that. If that feels overwhelming, I think that's also okay. This is really a space that touches on so many areas of life. And so if that part of it is not your jam, then there's going to be other kinds of expertise or perspectives that you can bring. Yeah, I guess a combination answer of try not to be intimidated by the technical aspects, because really the foundations of it are not that complicated. And also recognize that we need a really wide range of different perspectives and different kinds of expertise in the space, not just computer scientists. So even if you don't want to dig in that far, you always want to have an appreciation of where your weaknesses or blind spots, and hopefully other people that you're interacting with who have different weaknesses and blind spots will recognize those as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's it. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thanks very much.